The morning sun filtered through the high windows of courtroom 237, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Detective Michael Carter sat rigid at the defendant's table, his police dress uniform feeling suddenly too tight around his neck. 15 years of distinguished service hung heavy on his shoulders, represented by the badges and commendations that now seemed to mock him. His weathered hands, usually steady from years of fieldwork, trembled slightly as they rested on the polished oak table. At the back of the courtroom, a German shepherd named Luke sat alert, his amber eyes never leaving his partner. The canine officer's ears twitched at every movement, every whisper that echoed through the tense chamber. Though department protocol dictated that Luke should have been reassigned weeks ago when the investigation began, his temporary handler, Officer Sarah Mitchell, hadn't had the heart to separate them completely. She understood that some bonds transcended regulations. Michael's mind drifted to their last case together, just 2 months ago. He and Luke had tracked down a missing child in the middle of a snowstorm, following a scent trail that had gone nearly cold. Luke had refused to give up, pushing through the bitter wind until they found the little girl huddled in an abandoned shed, cold but alive. The girl's mother had hugged them both, crying tears that froze on her cheeks in the winter air. That was what being a police officer meant to Michael: serving, protecting, making a difference. Now here he sat, accused of the very corruption he had spent his career fighting against. The evidence had appeared seemingly out of nowhere: mysterious deposits in an offshore account, surveillance photos linking him to known criminals, a burner phone with incriminating text messages found in his locker. It was all lies, fabricated so perfectly that even some of his closest colleagues had begun to doubt him. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces carefully neutral. Michael's heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. His attorney, a public defender who seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of the case, placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. The gesture felt hollow. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber. Judge William Harrison entered, his black robes swirling around him as he took his seat. His face, lined with decades of experience, betrayed nothing of his thoughts as he turned to address the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood, a piece of paper clutched in her hands. "We have, Your Honor." Michael closed his eyes for a moment, and in that darkness, he saw flashes of his life with Luke. Training sessions in the rain, late-night patrols in rough neighborhoods, quiet moments in the squad car sharing a sandwich. Luke had been there through his divorce, through the death of his father, through every up and down of the past 7 years. The dog wasn't just his partner, he was his anchor. In the matter of the state versus Michael Carter, on the charge of corruption and abuse of power, we find the defendant. The pause lasted an eternity. Guilty. The word fell like a physical blow. Around him, the courtroom erupted in murmurs and gasps, but Michael heard them as if from underwater. His vision tunneled, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. From the back of the courtroom came a low whine, Luke sensing his partner's distress. "Order," Judge Harrison commanded, his gavel crack cutting through the chaos. When silence fell again, he continued, his voice heavy with authority. "Michael Carter, please rise for sentencing." Michael stood on legs that felt like lead, his attorney's steadying hand on his elbow. He raised his eyes to meet the judge's gaze, determined to face his fate with the dignity his badge had once represented. "Mr. Prosody, Carter, your position as a law enforcement officer makes this betrayal of public trust particularly egregious. The evidence presented shows a calculated abuse of power that cannot be overlooked. I hereby sentence you to 15 years in federal prison." The sentence hit him like a physical blow, but it wasn't the years that crushed him most. It was the knowledge that he would have to leave Luke behind. The thought of never again feeling that cold nose nudging his hand, never throwing a tennis ball in the park, never sharing quiet moments in the K-9 unit's break room, it was unbearable. As the judge prepared to leave, Michael found his voice. It came out rough, cracking with emotion. "Your Honor," he called out, causing the judge to pause. "Before I'm taken away, I have one last request." He swallowed hard, fighting to maintain his composure. "Please, let me say goodbye to Luke." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison studied Michael for a long moment, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. Perhaps he saw something in Michael's eyes, some reflection of the decorated officer he had been, or maybe he simply understood the depth of the bond between a handler and their canine partner. 3 minutes, the judge declared, nodding to Officer Mitchell. As Sarah unclipped Luke's leash, the German Shepherd didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward Michael, his claws clicking rapidly against the polished floor, each step echoing with urgency and devotion. The sound of his approach was like a countdown to goodbye, each click bringing them closer to their final moment together. What happened next would change everything, but for now, in this moment, there was just a man and his dog, and a bond that even handcuffs couldn't break. Michael dropped to his knees as Luke reached him, no longer caring about maintaining his composure. The German Shepherd pressed against him with such force that Michael nearly lost his balance, despite the steadying presence of his handcuffs. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, burying his face in Luke's fur. "I let you down. I won't be there anymore." Luke whimpered softly, pushing his muzzle into Michael's chest as if trying to get closer, to eliminate any space between them. The dog's whole body trembled with emotion, his tail low but still moving slightly, a gesture of comfort despite the circumstances. For a moment, the courtroom faded away, and they were just partners again, sharing another quiet moment together. But suddenly, Luke's body language changed. His muscles tensed beneath Michael's touch, and his nose began working frantically against Michael's service jacket. The change was so abrupt that Michael pulled back slightly, confused by the sudden shift in his partner's behavior. Years of working together had taught him to trust Luke's instincts, and right now, those instincts were trying to tell him something. "What is it, boy?" Michael murmured, but Luke was already in full alert mode. The dog's trained indicators were unmistakable: the rigid posture, the focused sniffing, the slight curl of his lip. These were the same signals that had led them to countless discoveries during their years of service. Luke began pulling at the fabric of Michael's jacket with increasing urgency, his sharp barks echoing off the high courtroom ceiling. The sudden sound shattered the solemn atmosphere, drawing every eye in the room. Michael had heard that bark hundreds of times before. It was Luke's alert, his way of signaling that he'd found something significant. "Control your dog, Officer Mitchell," the judge ordered, but there was more curiosity than anger in his voice. Sarah started forward, but Luke's behavior was too professional, too focused to be simple distress. "Your Honor," Sarah spoke up, her voice steady despite the tension. "Luke is giving a trained alert. He's indicating the presence of something specific." One of the bailiffs stepped forward cautiously, his hand reflexively touching his weapon. "Sir, I need to check the defendant's jacket." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant has already been searched." "Be quiet," Judge Harrison interrupted, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. "Proceed with the search." The bailiff approached carefully. Though Luke showed no aggression, his focus remained entirely on whatever he had detected. As the officer began checking Michael's jacket, Luke's barking intensified, becoming more insistent. Then, with a metallic clink that seemed to echo through the now silent courtroom, a small object fell to the floor. It was a recording device, no larger than a pack of gum, but its impact on the room was immediate and electric. The prosecutor's face went pale, and he stepped forward quickly, his voice shaking slightly. "This doesn't prove anything," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice suggested otherwise. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "What exactly is that device, and how did it end up in the defendant's jacket?" Michael stared at the recorder, his mind racing. The jacket had been in evidence lockup for weeks, part of the clothing he'd been wearing when arrested. He hadn't worn it since that day, but now here it was, apparently carrying a secret that someone had tried to hide. "Play it," the judge ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. The bailiff picked up the device with trembling fingers and pressed play. Static filled the air for a moment, and then voices emerged, familiar voices that made Michael's blood run cold. "Just plant the evidence," a gruff voice commanded. "No one's going to question it. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Get it done." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Michael felt his heart stop, then begin pounding furiously. He knew that voice, had heard it give orders, offer advice, shape his career. It belonged to Captain Ray Harding, his former supervisor and mentor. Luke stood firm beside Michael, his alert posture unwavering, as if he understood the magnitude of what he had just uncovered. Sarah Mitchell's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. The prosecutor was already on his phone, speaking in urgent whispers. "That's enough." Judge Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. His face had darkened considerably as he processed what he'd just heard. "Bailiffs, secure that device as evidence. Mr. Carter will be remanded to custody while we investigate this new development." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom before landing on the prosecutor. "And someone get Captain Harding in here. Now." As the bailiffs led Michael back toward the holding cells, he caught one last glimpse of Luke, still standing proud and alert where he had made his discovery. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and in that moment, Michael saw what he'd always known, that the bond between a handler and their canine partner went beyond training, beyond duty, beyond even the law itself. Luke hadn't just found evidence, he had found the truth. The heavy door of the holding cell closed behind Michael with a familiar clang, but for the first time since his arrest, the sound didn't fill him with despair. Instead, his mind raced with possibilities. The recording device was just the beginning. If Luke had found this, what else might be hidden? What other secrets were waiting to be uncovered? Sitting on the hard bench, Michael closed his eyes and remembered the look of absolute certainty in Luke's stance as he made his alert. His partner hadn't given up on him, hadn't stopped fighting for the truth. Now, Michael knew he couldn't give up either. Whatever conspiracy had brought him down was about to unravel, one thread at a time, and it had started with a dog's unwavering loyalty and unshakable instincts. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Judge Harrison's chambers as he replayed the recording for the third time. Each repetition of Captain Harding's voice seemed to fill the room with a heavier sense of corruption. The judge's expression darkened as he pressed the stop button, his weathered fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. Outside in the hallway, Captain Ray Harding waited, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. When the bailiff approached him with the judge's summons, Harding straightened his tie with steady hands, hands that had signed countless false reports, hands that had pointed fingers at innocent officers, hands that had nearly destroyed Michael Carter's life. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell had made a crucial decision. Instead of returning Luke to the K-9 unit's kennel, she took him to the department's evidence storage room. "If there's more to find, boy," she whispered, "we need to find it now." Luke's earlier discovery had proven that his instincts were more reliable than any human investigation. The storage room was a maze of metal shelves and cardboard boxes, each containing pieces of cases both solved and unsolved. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the dim light as Luke began working methodically through the aisles. His nose twitched constantly, sifting through years of collected evidence, searching for anything out of place. They reached the section containing Michael's personal effects, the items seized during his arrest. Luke's behavior changed instantly. His tail went rigid, and his breathing became more focused. Sarah recognized the shift. It was the same intense concentration he'd shown in the courtroom. "Show me," she encouraged softly. Luke led her to a sealed evidence box, pawing at it insistently. With gloved hands, Sarah carefully opened the container. Inside, beneath Michael's folded uniforms and personal items, she found a manila envelope that didn't appear on the evidence log. Her hands trembled as she carefully extracted it. The envelope contained photographs, grainy but unmistakable images showing Captain Harding meeting with known criminals in various locations around the city. Behind the photos were documents outlining a complex network of bribes and payoffs. The dates aligned perfectly with cases that had mysteriously fallen apart, with evidence that had vanished, with officers who had been discredited or forced out. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Luke pressed against her leg, as if offering support for what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about Michael anymore. It was about years of systematic corruption that had infected the entire department. Back in the judge's chambers, The confrontation was reaching its climax. Harding sat rigidly in the chair across from Judge Harrison's desk, his face a mask of practiced innocence. The recorder sat between them like a loaded weapon. "Would you care to explain this, Captain?" Harrison asked, his voice deceptively calm as he played the damning audio once again. Harding's facade cracked for just a moment, a slight twitch of his eye, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. "Your Honor, that recording could have been doctored. It could have been—" "Stop!" The judge's command cut through Harding's excuses like a blade. "Officers are already searching your office. The FBI has been notified. This conspiracy ends today." As if on cue, Sarah burst into the chambers, the envelope of evidence clutched in her hands. Luke followed close behind, his presence adding weight to the moment. "Your Honor," she said breathlessly, "there's more, much more." The judge examined the photos and documents, each new piece of evidence causing his frown to deepen. Harding's face had gone ashen, his carefully maintained control crumbling as he watched years of manipulation and deceit laid bare on the judge's desk. "You didn't count on the dog, did you?" Harrison asked, looking up at Harding. "All your careful planning, all your elaborate schemes, and you were undone by a canine officer's loyalty to his partner." Harding's composure finally shattered. "You don't understand," he snarled, rising from his chair. "The department needed control. We needed to maintain order, to keep certain elements in check. Carter was too clean, too idealistic. He would have ruined everything we built." Luke's low growl filled the room, a sound that made Harding sink back into his chair. The captain's words hung in the air, a confession born of desperation and wounded pride. Judge Harrison pressed his intercom button. "Send in the federal agents," he commanded. As two FBI agents entered the chambers, the judge turned to Sarah. "Officer Mitchell, please retrieve Mr. Carter from holding. I believe we need to revisit his sentencing." Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. "Come on, Luke," she said. "Let's go get your partner." As they walked through the courthouse corridors, Luke's tail began to wag for the first time since Michael's arrest. The dog seemed to understand that their long nightmare was finally ending, that justice, true justice, was about to prevail. The heavy door to the holding area opened with a metallic groan. Michael looked up, his eyes widening at the sight of Sarah's smile and Luke's confident stride. "What's happening?" he asked, standing quickly. Sarah's voice shook with joy as she replied, "We found it all, Michael. Everything. Luke didn't just find that recorder. He led us to proof of the entire conspiracy. It's over. You're coming home." The cell door opened, and this time when Luke rushed to Michael, there were no handcuffs to hinder their embrace. Michael buried his face in Luke's fur once again, but now his tears were of relief, of vindication, of profound gratitude for a partner who had never lost faith. The next 48 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity that shook the department to its core. The courthouse buzzed with constant motion as federal agents swept through offices and evidence rooms, their presence marking the beginning of what would become one of the largest police corruption investigations in the city's history. Michael sat in a conference room, Luke lying faithfully at his feet, as he recounted everything he could remember from his years working under Captain Harding. Every case that had seemed odd, every decision that hadn't quite made sense, all of it now fell into a disturbing pattern. Sarah sat beside him, occasionally adding details from the evidence she and Luke had discovered. "The financial records go back at least 7 years," the lead FBI agent explained, spreading documents across the table. "Harding wasn't working alone. We're seeing connections to judges, prosecutors, even local politicians." He paused, looking at Michael with genuine respect. "You were getting too close, Detective Carter. That's why they needed to discredit you." Michael absently scratched behind Luke's ears as he remembered the cases that had raised his suspicions. Drug busts where key evidence vanished, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, fellow officers who were pushed out after asking too many questions. "How many innocent people were convicted because of this?" he asked quietly. "We're reviewing every case Harding touched," the agent replied. "It's going to take months, maybe years, to untangle everything." He shuffled through more papers, then added, "But thanks to what your partner found, we have a solid starting point." Luke's tail thumped against the floor at the word partner, and Michael couldn't help but smile. The German Shepherd hadn't left his side since his release, as if determined to make up for their forced separation. Even now, the dog's eyes regularly scanned the room, remaining alert and protective despite the friendly environment. Later that evening, as Michael and Luke walked through the police station's parking lot, they encountered a sight that made them both pause. Officers, dozens of them, were gathered near the entrance. For a moment, Michael tensed, uncertain of their reception. But then Officer Rodriguez, a veteran of 20 years, stepped forward. "We knew something wasn't right," Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we didn't have the courage to dig deeper. We failed you, Michael. We failed the badge." One by one, officers approached to shake Michael's hand or pat Luke's head. Some offered apologies, others shared their own stories of witnessing irregularities but feeling powerless to act. The wall of silence that had protected corruption for so long was finally crumbling. Inside the station, the mood was electric, with a mixture of shock, anger, and determination. Desks were being searched, computers examined, files scrutinized. Every officer knew that more revelations would come, that more betrayals would be uncovered. But there was also a sense of cleansing, of a festering wound finally being exposed to healing light. Sarah led Michael and Luke to the K-9 unit's office, which had become a makeshift command center for the investigation. Photos and documents covered the walls, connected by red strings that traced the web of corruption. At the center was a photograph of Captain Harding, his confident smile now seeming more sinister than charismatic. "We found something else," Sarah said, pulling out a fresh file. "Remember that drug bust last year? The one where the evidence disappeared?" She spread out a series of surveillance photos. "Luke didn't just find proof of your innocence. He found proof that Harding was working with the cartel. He was using the department to eliminate their competition while protecting their operations." Michael felt his stomach turn. The magnitude of the betrayal seemed to grow with each new discovery. Luke pressed against his leg, offering silent support as he had countless times before. "The FBI wants to bring you in as a special investigator," Sarah continued. "You and Luke. Nobody knows these cases better than you do, and after what they did to you." She trailed off, then added softly, "We need you, Michael. Both of you." Before Michael could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Officers were rushing toward the main entrance, radios crackling with urgent messages. Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert, and her eyes widened as she read it. "Harding," she said, looking up at Michael. "He's escaped custody." The words hung in the air for a moment before Luke's head snapped up, his ears forward, his body tensing with familiar purpose. Michael felt an old energy course through him, the instincts of years of partnership clicking back into place. "Where was he last seen?" he asked, already moving toward the door. Luke fell into step beside him, their movements synchronized by years of trust and training. Sarah grabbed her keys, following them. "Downtown, near the River District. But Michael, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his voice firm. "This ends tonight. All of it." He looked down at Luke, seeing the same determination in his partner's stance. "Ready, boy?" Luke's sharp bark echoed through the hallway, a sound that every criminal in the city had learned to fear. The hunt was on, and this time, the hunters were after bigger prey than either of them had ever pursued before. The River District's abandoned warehouses loomed against the darkening sky, their broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. Michael, Sarah, and Luke moved silently through the shadows, accompanied by a tactical team that spread out to cover the perimeter. Rain had begun to fall, a light drizzle that made the crumbling concrete slick and treacherous. Luke worked methodically, his nose close to the ground, processing layers of scent that told a story only he could read. Michael watched his partner's body language intently, reading the subtle signals they'd perfected over years of working together. Every slight tail movement, every shift in posture spoke volumes. "He's been here," Michael whispered, noting Luke's increasing focus. "Recently." Sarah raised her hand, signaling the tactical team to hold position. In the distance, police sirens wailed, but here by the river, an eerie silence pressed in around them. Luke's ears suddenly pricked forward, and his body tensed. Before Michael could react, the sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet. "There!" Sarah shouted, spotting a figure darting between buildings. Luke burst into action, with Michael close behind. Years of partnership had made them one unit, moving in perfect synchronization as they pursued their target. The chase led them through a maze of abandoned buildings, past rusted machinery and broken crates. Harding was fast, desperate, but he couldn't outrun a determined German shepherd. They cornered him in an old processing plant, the rain now pouring through holes in the roof. Harding stood on a metal catwalk, his back to a broken window that overlooked the churning river below. His usually immaculate uniform was soaked and muddy, his composed demeanor replaced by wild desperation. "It's over, Captain," Michael called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. Luke stood beside him, focused and ready, but not advancing. They had their quarry cornered. Now was the time for justice, not vengeance. "Over?" Harding laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the metal walls. "You have no idea what you've done, Carter. The system worked. We kept order. Without us, this city will tear itself apart." "The system was corrupt," Michael responded, taking a careful step forward. "You betrayed everything that badge stands for. How many good cops did you destroy? How many innocent people did you send to prison?" "I did what had to be done," Harding shouted, his composure cracking completely. "Someone had to control the chaos. You were too naive to understand, too idealistic, just like your father was." Michael froze. "What did you say about my father?" A cruel smile twisted Harding's features. "Why do you think he never made detective, Carter? He was just like you, always asking questions, always wanting to do things by the book. He had to be kept in his place." The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. His father had died a beat cop, always passed over for promotion despite his exemplary record. Now, decades later, the truth emerged, one more life touched by the corruption that had infected the department like a cancer. Luke sensed Michael's distress and pressed against his leg, offering silent support. The gesture centered him, reminded him of why they were here. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. "Captain Ray Harding," Michael said, his voice steady, "you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and attempted murder." Harding's hand moved toward his waistband. "I'm not going to prison," he snarled. Luke's warning growl filled the space. Sarah and the tactical team were moving into position, their weapons trained on the former captain. But before anyone could react, Harding made his final desperate move. He pulled a small device from his pocket, a detonator. "This whole warehouse is rigged," he announced, his finger hovering over the button. "One press, and it all ends." "Is that what you want, Carter?" Time seemed to slow. Michael saw Luke's muscles bunch, recognized the subtle shift in posture that preceded action. Their years of partnership had created a connection that went beyond words, beyond training. They moved as one. As Harding's finger descended toward the detonator, Luke launched forward, a blur of focused power and precision. Michael's shout of "take him" was barely needed. Luke had already calculated the angle, the force, the exact moment to strike. The German shepherd hit Harding with controlled force, knocking the detonator away while pinning the former captain against the railing. The device skittered across the catwalk, coming to rest at Michael's feet as he rushed forward to secure his former mentor. Like father, like son, Harding spat as Michael cuffed him. "Both of you too stubborn to understand how the world really works." "No," Michael replied, watching as Sarah collected the detonator. "We understood perfectly. We just chose to stand for something better." In the days that followed, the full scope of Harding's corruption emerged. The investigation uncovered decades of manipulation, bribery, and abuse of power. Dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals were released, their cases overturned. The department underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. Michael and Luke became symbols of that change. Their story, of unwavering loyalty, of justice prevailing against overwhelming odds, inspired a new generation of officers. The K-9 unit expanded, with Luke helping to train new handlers and their partners. One quiet evening, Michael sat in his office, now adorned with new commendations. Honest ones, earned through integrity rather than corruption. Luke dozed beside his desk, gray starting to show around his muzzle, but his spirit as strong as ever. Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding a fresh case file. "Ready for another one?" she asked, smiling at the pair. Luke's head lifted at her voice, and Michael felt that familiar surge of purpose. They had exposed the darkness, helped clean up the department, but their real work, protecting and serving with honor, was never done. "What do you say, partner?" Michael asked, looking down at his faithful companion. Luke's tail wagged as he stood, ready as always to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they had proven that true loyalty could overcome corruption, that one dog's unwavering faith could spark a revolution of justice, and that the strongest partnerships were built not on power or fear, but on trust, dedication, and an unshakable belief in doing what's right. As they headed out into the evening, Michael reflected that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism come not from grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but from the simple, steadfast loyalty of a partner who never loses faith. Luke had taught him that, and it was a lesson he would never forget.